The late 19th and early years of the 20th century were a period of peace and growing economic integration, but at the same time, public opinion was becoming more nationalist and imperialist. Also, there was more popular press with cheap newspapers in wide circulation, and the extension of the right to vote all ensured that public opinion increasingly influenced foreign policy. Imperialism, nationalism, and militarism were prevalent ideologies in the 2 decades before the Great War. European imperialism and the expansion of power into Africa and Asia in the final 2 decades of the 19th century were caused by several factors. Businessmen and industrialists put pressure on their governments to annex areas where they had important economic interests. Strategy also played a key role. Britain, for instance, occupied Egypt in order to safeguard the Suez Canal and the route to India. Increasingly, the great powers, fully supported by public opinion, began to believe that they could only remain in power as long as they had colonial empires which could provide trade, access to raw materials, and opportunities for settlement. Statesmen and political thinkers became affected by social Darwinism and were convinced that international life was a struggle for survival where only the strongest nations would survive. Imperialism went hand in hand with nationalism. Earlier in the 19th century in Italy and Germany, nationalism had been essentially a liberal ideology aimed at achieving national unification and establishing a constitutional government. The main aim of nationalists was to unite their countries. Once this was achieved, the emphasis of nationalism gradually shifted to asserting the power of a nation on a global stage. To unify their countries and overcome class or regional differences, governments frequently exploited nationalism by pursuing a policy that later historians have called social imperialism. Nationalism and imperialism inevitably encouraged militarism. The armed forces were the key instruments not only in defense, but also in carving out empires and projecting national strength. In Germany, the army enjoyed huge prestige and was independent of parliamentary control, while in Britain, public opinion played a key role in forcing the government to accelerate the construction of modern battleships, the dreadnoughts, in 1908. In both Germany and Britain, pressure groups were formed to force the government to accelerate the buildup of armed forces. The acceptance of military values by large sections of people in all the great European states undoubtedly contributed to the mood which made war possible and to the enthusiasm with which the outbreak of war in 1914 was greeted in every belligerent state. Extreme nationalism, imperialism, and militarism were all major components of fascism and National Socialism. But in Italy and France, extreme national groups were already attempting to fuse these ideologies with socialism to create a more socially united and therefore stronger national state. It was the impact and consequences of the First World War that enabled fascism and Nazism to become mass movements. In Italy, economic crises and a sense of being cheated at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 of its just rewards as a member of the victorious nations, and above all, the fear of a Bolshevik revolution created the context in which Benito Mussolini, the leader of the Italian Fascist Party, gained power in 1922. In Germany, it took another 10 years and the impact of the Great Depression before Hitler and the German National Socialism would come to power. In 1914, Italy, Germany, and Japan had managed to acquire only modest empires. All three saw themselves as have-not powers, which determined their foreign policy right up to 1941. In reality, Germany was far from being a have-not power. It did have the economy, or the largest economy in Europe, and its population growth was tremendous. It was also arming just like France and, competing with the British and the French. But the First World War knocked away all of Germany's territory, and it began to dream of dominating the middle of Europe. This prize was snatched away with defeat on the Western Front in 1918. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of all of its wartime gains, global investments, colonies, even scientists and patents. In the eyes of the German people, they were now really a have-not nation. The key question was, how would Germany exploit its latent strength? Would Germany use it as its foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann, did between 1924 and 1929 to cooperate with Britain and France in peaceful reconstruction of Europe? Or would Hitler sweep away and into power by the Great Depression? Well, I mean, that's what happened. And it became increasingly clear which option Germany was going to take. Hitler was determined to colonize Western Russia and create living space for the German people. Italy liked to think of itself as a great power and see itself in the tradition of ancient Rome, but in reality, Italy was one of the weakest of the European powers, both economically and militarily. Its one attempt to colonize in Africa was their invasion of Abyssinia, and it failed utterly. Italian foreign policy right up to 1940 was essentially opportunist and aimed at securing influence and territory in the Mediterranean. Italy could gain most when Europe was divided into rival alliances. Although Italy emerged from the war strengthened by the collapse of Austria-Hungary, the failure of the Allies to honor the promises made in the Treaty of London left it embittered and even more determined to assert its power in the Mediterranean. Indeed, what was called the mutilated victory of 1918 was one of the causes of fascism growing in popularity and Mussolini coming to power in 1922. In the 1930s, Mussolini initially hoped to benefit from Hitler's seizure of power to extract concessions from Britain and France, but their failure to agree to the Italian occupation of Abyssinia gave Mussolini little option but to gravitate towards Nazi Germany. In 1914, Japan was a strong regional power with a population of some 46 million. Japan had initially, in 1858, been compelled to grant the Western nations considerable economic privileges and rights. But by 1899, Japan had not only regained its economic freedom due to massive and rapid modernization, but also embarked on a period of territorial expansion. Lacking the strength to operate in isolation and foreseeing a confrontation with Russia in Manchuria, Japan negotiated an alliance with Great Britain, which enabled it to defeat Russia in 1905 and strengthen its position in Korea and southern Manchuria. Driven on by intense nationalism of its army officers and various patriotic societies, both of which exercised powerful influence on foreign policy up into 1945, the Japanese government attempted to exploit the mounting chaos in China caused by the overthrow of the Manchu dynasty in 1912. For the next 30 years, the main aim of Japanese foreign policy was directed towards exploiting this division in China in order to build up its own economically self-sufficient empire, the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. This would bring them into direct conflict with the United States in 1941. The halves were Great Britain and France, and both of them emerged from World War I as exhausted powers. France had been defeated by Prussia in 1871, and both economically and in terms of population size had been overtaken by Germany and Britain. France's industrial base was small, its coal deposits were a fraction of those of Britain and Germany. France had nevertheless managed to rebuild and re-equip its army and compensate for the relative smallness of its population by building up a large North African empire, which would provide men in time of war. However, the key to France's survival as an independent power lay in its ability to forge a strong alliance system to contain Germany. This crucial move in this direction was an alliance with Russia in 1894, and later one with Great Britain. With British and later U.S. help, France was able to defeat the Central Powers in 1918, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. France emerged in 1919 as an exhausted power. It had failed to weaken Germany permanently through the Treaty of Versailles, and largely as a result of the Depression, its attempts to integrate Germany peacefully into Europe also came to nothing. With the Nazi seizure of power and Italy's realignment with Germany after 1936, France increasingly became dependent on Britain, and in September 1939 went to war with Germany as Britain's junior partner. France was defeated by Germany in a brief campaign in June of 1940. Although Great Britain was very wealthy in 1914, the fundamental basis of its power was being eroded. The British Empire built its wealth on domination of the world's trade, and it could no longer dominate it. Countries like France, Russia, Germany, and even Italy were all capable of playing a global role, and their virtual trade monopoly had ended. Britain was being overtaken by Germany and the United States, and absolute control of the seas was threatened by the new German Navy. Consequently, Britain attempted to diffuse challenges to its position by a policy of compromise and appeasement. Britain was ready to appease Germany too, but only at the cost of Germany abandoning its naval challenge. It was primarily this challenge that led Britain to entering the war in 1914. Britain emerged from the war in 1919 as a clear winner. All of its war aims had been fulfilled, but the war had also gravely weakened the British Empire financially and encouraged the growth of nationalism in India, Ireland, and Egypt. Britain's decline was masked by U.S. isolationism and weakness of the USSR and France. As before 1914, Britain tried to safeguard its position through avoiding entanglements and appeasing potential enemies. Only when it became clear that a settlement with Nazi Germany was impossible did Britain take the radical step of guaranteeing Poland. Ultimately, Britain went to war in 1939, as in 1914, to stop the German domination of Europe. By the autumn of 1914, Britain had escaped immediate defeat by Nazi Germany, but to continue fighting, it had increasingly become financially and militarily dependent on the United States. Both Russia and the United States were seen in different ways as the great powers of the future. By 1914, Russia had a population that was double the size of Germany's and an economy that was developing rapidly. Nevertheless, the effective deployment of this massive strength was always threatened by domestic instability, which had already boiled over into open revolt in 1905. By 1914, foreign observers were unanimous that Russia was sitting on the edge of a volcano. In 1917, that volcano erupted. After 3 years of total war, Russia was engulfed by revolution. With the victory of the Red Army in the Russian Civil War in 1920, the European powers were confronted with Bolshevism in power in Russia. Briefly, the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1920, it seemed as if the Red Army would drive deep into Europe, but it was defeated outside Warsaw and forced to retreat. The creation of a Polish state embracing much of Western Ukraine ensured that the USSR was cut off from Central Europe until the partition of Poland with Nazi Germany in September 1939. However, the coming of power of the Nazis in 1933, the USSR joined the League of Nations and in 1935 signed a pact with France. At this point, it seemed as if the pre-1914 Franco-Russian alliance had been restored, but Britain and France's appeasement of Germany in 1938 during the Sudeten crisis and their deep distrust of Bolshevism ultimately persuaded Stalin to sign the Nazi-Soviet pact with Hitler in August 1939. In the short term, this agreement gave the USSR greater security and kept it out of war. Stalin assumed that Britain, France, and Germany would exhaust themselves fighting in Western Europe. Instead, France was defeated in June 1940, and the British were expelled from the continent. In June 1941, Hitler invaded the USSR. His ultimate defeat in 1945 opened the way up to the USSR becoming a superpower. The United States, for most of the 19th century, had been shielded from any danger of continental European intervention by Britain's undisputed supremacy of the seas. The U.S. had consequently been able to enjoy the benefits of neutrality and isolation in complete security. However, the formidable challenge to the Royal Navy launched by Germany did open up the disturbing prospect of a German naval presence in the Atlantic, and by 1914 the United States had taken the precaution of building up the third largest navy in the world. Like Japan, the United States had also become an imperial power. In the colonial war against Spain in 1898, U.S. forces had seized Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and the Philippines and Hawaii in the Far East. Although U.S. public opinion was still isolationist, the USA's extensive financial and economic interest in both Europe and the Far East made it increasingly more difficult for it to keep out of world affairs. This was clearly seen in April 1917, when, in response to Germany's determination to sink all neutral ships trading with Britain, of which the largest percentage were the Americans, the U.S. declared war on Germany. By 1919, the United States had already emerged as a potential superpower, but far from playing a world role, it retreated into isolation when Congress effectively vetoed membership of the League of Nations. Yet even then, the United States could not turn its back on European economy, and between 1924 and 1929 played a key role in formatting the Dawes and Young plans, which did much economically to stabilize post-war Europe. In the late 1920s, there was even speculation that the United States would join the League of Nations. However, the impact of the Great Depression drove the United States back into isolation. Despite the coming of power of Hitler, Congress was determined to keep the United States out of another world war. Although the United States was ready to supply Britain with money and war material in 1940, it was only the Japanese attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States that finally brought it into the Second World War. In the First World War, one German general described his country's two principal wartime allies, the Turkish Empire and Austria-Hungary, as rotting corpses. Austria-Hungary consisted of two virtually independent states, which shared a common crown and operated a joint foreign policy. The Hungarians strengthened the anti-Russian tendency of Austria foreign policy, as they feared the impact of Russia's sympathy for the Balkan Slavs on their own large Slav population. Austria-Hungary contained within its frontiers some 11 different nationalities, which were to present the peacemakers of 1919 with inseparable problems when they came to draw up the frontiers of the new small states that replaced the empire. Austria's fate was perceived by contemporaries to be linked with the Ottoman Empire. Vienna feared that the Balkan states, which had virtually driven the Turks out of the Balkans by 1912, would eventually also destroy the Austrian Empire. Above all, the empire felt itself threatened by the emergence of a strong, independent Serbia, which it was convinced enjoyed the backing of Russia and was aiming to liberate the Serbs in the Austrian province of Bosnia. The empire's main defense against the Russian remained the Austro-German alliance of 1879. Through this alliance, the German problem became linked with the Balkan or Eastern question, which potentially lethal consequences for the peace of Europe, as Berlin's support for Austria began to be regarded by France and Russia as a camouflage for German expansion into southeastern Europe. In 1914, the Turkish Empire was in a more advanced stage of decay than Austria, but even before 1914, there had been hints of the remarkable revival of energy that was to galvanize the Turks under Mustafa Kemal into forcing the British and French in 1922 and 23 to renegotiate the punitive peace treaty of World War I. In 1908, the Young Turk movement, in a desperate attempt to prevent the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, seized power and began the process of modernizing Turkey. Turkey was then drawn increasingly into the German orbit. In 1913, the German government was invited to send a military mission to Constantinople to help modernize and re-equip the Turkish army. That should be Istanbul. I'm sorry, the British. I'm reading from a British thing. I'm just going to go on a rant. The British, really? Constantinople, really? It's Istanbul. It had been since 1450s. But the British, they never modernized. Okay, so anyways. The Germans went and helped modernize and re-equip the Turkish army. Turkey's defeat in 1918 led to the loss of its empire in the Middle East to Britain, shocking, and France. I don't know why I'm being so anti-Anglo. I mean, screw the French too. In the Second World War, Turkey remained neutral.